I'm going to talk today about the case of Jodi Arias. Jodi admits killing her boyfriend Travis Alexander in June 2008. It's a case of self-defense. She made things very difficult for herself though, because she didn't admit what had happened for a long time afterwards. She lied both to police and to everyone to cover up what had happened. And you might think that indicates that it was a case of murder, but it turns out the truth is different. She was, though, convicted of murder in 2013, and there was then a penalty retrial to determine the sentence, whether it was going to be a death sentence. But at the end of all those trials, she was sentenced to life without parole. And I very firmly believe she was actually acting in self-defense, and in this video I'm going to try and explain why I think that. First of all, Travis's body was found quite a few days later, and it was obvious that he'd been shot and stabbed a large number of times. And again, you might think that indicates it's a case of murder, but when we look very carefully at the evidence, I'm going to argue that it was in fact Travis that attacked Jodi, and she was defending herself not just once but at least 2 or 3 times. And she first defended herself with a gun, which she testified about, and then I believe later there was another fight involving when Jodi had a knife, and it was in this fight that Travis actually lost his life. It's a very complicated case because the prosecution argued that this was a planned murder and brought forth various bits of evidence that are, I think, very doubtful and ambiguous. It really doesn't make a lot of sense to call this a planned murder. It's really a domestic violence case. Domestic violence arguments are very common. They're happening all the time, all over the world, every minute of the day. People get upset, lose their tempers for various reasons, become violent, and just occasionally this violence escalates. Somebody gets scared, somebody reaches for a weapon, somebody gets injured. The fighting can escalate and eventually end with a tragedy, a death. And I believe that Jodi's case is a case exactly of that. Okay, first thing, why was Jodi convicted? The first thing would be that seemed suspicious was a gun stolen from her home. A week before the fight in which Travis died, and it turns out just by chance that Travis was shot once. The bullet ended up lodged in his cheek, and that was a .25 caliber bullet. And just by chance, the gun that was stolen from Jodi's home in Wairika a week before, that was also a .25 bullet. But it has to be said, there are several things to indicate this gun had nothing to do with it. First of all, although it was the right caliber bullet, the bullets stolen in Wairika were actually hollow point bullets, according to a burglary report. The burglar told us that the bullets that were stolen were hollow point bullets, whereas it turns out that the bullet recovered from Travis's keep
was not a hollow point bullet. That didn't really come out properly at trial. I think the defence was negligent in not establishing that for the jury, because it would really help them to understand that this gun that was stolen a week earlier had nothing to do with the case. And the other thing to be said about that is there is now a witness who knew that Travis owned a gun. This witness didn't come forward until the end of the first trial, by which time it was really too late. He has, I believe, now submitted an affidavit to say that he knew Travis way back many years earlier. He knew Travis bought a gun. I think he went shooting with him. And so that was rather prejudicial evidence to make it look like Jodi had planned this and sort of kind of staged this burglary a week before. But I don't believe that's the truth about this case. The first thing really to show that there's something odd about this case is there wasn't a motive. Travis was actually really an ex-boyfriend. They'd carried on the relationship, but although they'd carried on talking to each other, having some sexual activity, the relationship really wasn't going anywhere. They were having arguments. Travis was quite aggressive in these arguments, aggressive, abusive. They actually had an argument about a week before in which he compared her to Hitler, made all sorts of threats, told her how much he hated her. Really pretty strong stuff. He also appeared to be jealous. He was asking her if she had another boyfriend. And I think it was this jealousy that produced the aggression. It's not entirely obvious, but there was this long text conversation a week before. But as for Jodi, she had no reason to want to kill Travis. She was actually looking for a new boyfriend, and had arranged to go and meet a chap called Ryan Burns the very next day. In fact, she did go and meet him. And after this fight in which Travis died, and she'd been carrying on a relationship with Ryan Burns because the relationship with Travis had gone nowhere. She'd left him. She'd gone back to Wairika. She was living in Mesa, but she was no longer living in Mesa. She'd gone back to Wairika. She'd started looking for other men on woman dating sites. And so she had no reason to want him dead, but the prosecution are arguing that she stole this gun from her own home and drove this enormous distance to Wairika to murder Travis. I don't think it makes any sense at all. There's a great complication in the case because the prosecution say she used gas cans to somehow hide her visit to Mesa. And they claim she lied about returning a third gas can she bought, but it turns out that evidence wasn't solid. They went to check the store records to see if there was a record of Jodi returning this gas can, and they couldn't find it. But it turns out the store relocated in 2010. They didn't try to check if the records were complete. The witness didn't know if the records were complete. She just admitted she thought they were, but she didn't know. She couldn't be 100%. And when you look at all the evidence, the fact is that Jodi bought this gas can from Walmart for cash. She then kept the receipt. Now, if she was really this was really part of the murder plan, she wouldn't have kept that receipt because it would be incriminating. She would have got rid of the receipt. She also kept gas receipts, all kinds of records, on which the prosecution then really depended to try and prove that she'd hidden her visit to Mesa. I'm convinced that's all nonsense. They pointed to a few other things, like she'd died, she'd reverted back to having brown hair from blonde hair, and she'd turned her phone off at one point on the journey, which is readily explained by
just wanting to save the battery, having temporarily misplaced the charger, or not wanting to go to the bother of finding the charger. So she just turned her phone off. So it's these tiny little clues that the prosecution are saying mean that this was a planned murder, but there's so much evidence to show this wasn't a planned murder at all. Instead, something else happened. The main issue, besides whether this was all planned hours and days and even a week or more ahead, is the issue of whether the gunshot was first. There was a lot of testimony on this, and Dr. Horn, the medical examiner, had a theory that the gunshot couldn't have been first. He thought the bullet had passed through the brain, and that would necessarily have, if the gunshot was first, that would be impossible because it would have completely incapacitated Travis immediately, is what he was arguing, or what the prosecutor was trying to get the medical examiner to argue. But this is just a nonsense theory. For one reason, there's a huge trail of blood around the apartment, which shows where Travis had been, and there is no way knife injuries, knife wounds would have led to this kind of level of bleeding. And you can see Travis was bleeding extensively from his mouth and his head, and the only way you could possibly get that is if Travis was shot first. The gunshot entered above his eyebrow on one side, passed behind his nose and ended up in his cheek. It wasn't a very powerful gun, so although this produced a great deal of bleeding in his mouth or nose, blood that was splattered around the apartment, you can see a trail, which we'll go into in much more detail later, starting near the toilet entrance. He goes over to the sinks, down the hallway, and then, most importantly, and this was never noticed at the trial really, he after bleeding on the carpet at the far end of the hallway, I'm absolutely convinced he turned and went back towards the bathroom. And there are then two large pools of blood near the linen cupboard and blood spatter inside the linen cupboard, and I'm convinced this is where the second fight was, where Jodi had a knife. It's impossible to guess why they fought again, but my guess is that Travis was very, very angry at being shot. He was determined to disarm Jodi or punish her or whatever. And they had this other fight that she couldn't get away. She, I believe, started stabbing down at him. I suspect he might have been on his knees while she was just above him, and then so she was stabbing down at him. There's a large number of rather shallow wounds to his back. There's also a few injuries to his head. And then I don't know how the fight progressed from there, but he had 2 or 3 stabs to his chest and torso from the front. He had cuts to his hands, evidently made during this fight. And then finally, we don't really know how or why, Jodi ended up slashing his throat, and that killed him. That would have resulted in his rapid death within a few seconds, I would say. And there are these 2 pools of blood by the linen cupboard. The other thing that I think is really quite significant is there's blood spatter inside the linen cupboard, and there's also a photo at one point which shows the linen cupboard door was closed. So we can tell really that somebody must have opened that linen cupboard door. And I cannot really see any scenario in which either of them would do that, other than Jodi was trying to help him in some way. For example, possibly by getting some sort of material to stop the bleeding or to make a bandage or something like that. I think she'd gone into the linen cupboard for some reason. That's the only reasonable way to explain that. So what I'm saying is Travis was bleeding on the carpet. Jodi's gone in the linen cupboard to get a towel or a bandage or something. She's apparently picked up the knife at some point. We don't know when or how. I believe Travis was still angry and he's attacked her again near the linen cupboard. As I say, if you look at the evidence, that's what it really shows. It was a very long trial. There were all kinds of attempts to show that Jodi's testimony wasn't the truth, but there's no proof that she lied about anything on the stand. Now, of course, the jury was skeptical. She'd lied originally. She'd ran off. She hadn't told anyone what had happened. And I'm sure that counted against her. I'm sure in the eyes at one point they asked her, why should we believe you now? I mean, that was the way they were thinking. That they decided that her story couldn't be true. And I think one of the possible problems was that the defence didn't really have a coherent, complete theory to explain how on earth Jodi could have shot and stabbed Travis in self-defence. But it still is, when you've put enough thought into it, where you've worked out what the evidence shows, that is the only reasonable conclusion. When you try to make a theory of murder, you run into all sorts of things that just don't fit. Some people admit that the gunshot was first, which absolutely follows from looking at the evidence at the scene, and they suggest Travis was shot in the shower, but that doesn't add up. Partly because obviously if he was shot while seated in the shower, there would be large amounts of blood coming from his head, and then he would have had to crawl over to near the toilet entrance where the blood trail actually starts. And there's no sign of blood from the shower over to where the trail of blood actually starts. Whereas according to Jodi's testimony, if he came charging out of the closet towards her while she was backed into the bathroom and she shot him from there, then it would make perfect sense for him to be shot as he charged, as he turned his head to the side, and for him to fall to the ground as he tackled Jodi near the toilet entrance. And you can see that's where the first pool of blood is, and that's where the trail of blood starts. Now, we don't really know what Jodi was doing after he was shot. Jodi says he said, "Fucking kill you, bitch." But what we can say is that Travis then went over the sink. He was clearly looking at the gunshot wound in the mirror. That's not the action of somebody who has just survived a murder attempt. You can tell really that he wasn't concerned. I mean, he wasn't trying to run away. He wasn't trying to fight Jodi if she was still standing nearby for the gun, say. It just doesn't make any sense for him to start worrying about what's happened if if his life is still in danger, if Jodi could shoot him again. So that's a clue again that this wasn't murder. And then, as I've already said, there's this whole point about Travis turning back, going back towards the linen cupboard, which really can only be interpreted as some kind of aggressive action on his part. And that's where this final fight happened. There was a great deal of dispute and evidence about whether Travis had been abusive in the past. I think there's no doubt there are abusive text messages. You can see all kinds of clues that he was abusive, but Jodi had trouble really proving that he was physically abusive, because these sorts of things don't often get recorded. Verbal abuse gets rewarded in things like text messages, but physical abuse doesn't get recorded. She does have a strange damaged finger that doesn't straighten properly, and she testified that he'd kicked her on a previous occasion, and that's why the finger was damaged. The prosecution want to argue that it was perhaps damaged on the day of the fight. So, well. But in any case, it shouldn't really be for Jodi to be trying to prove that she's innocent. She should be entitled to a presumption of innocence, not a presumption of guilt. So while it's obviously helps her to be able to corroborate that she was abused physically, if there's no evidence to show her testimony on that was untrue in any way, then we should really be accepting what she said. Okay, there were a few examples where during her testimony you'd have to say her memory wasn't quite perfect. There were some text messages that maybe didn't line up very well with her testimony on the days she said that these various things had happened. But I don't regard that as significant. She hasn't got any motive to lie about that sort of thing. And I do believe it's very likely there was physical abuse in this relationship. It was a very up and down relationship. Jodi writes in her diary about how he was obscenely mean to her and then very sweet and made up afterwards. This is a classic domestic violence, on and off, argumentative, making up relationship. A lot of people want to say, well, if he was abusive, why did she go back to see him? That's very common. This is a pattern of behaviour where women are in love. They think it's not going to happen again. They think the situation's changed. In this case, Jodi thought the relationship was ended and they just wanted to be friends. She just wanted to be friends with him. She'd taken him some CDs to see. That had resulted in some problems because he had a virus on his computer and he got annoyed about that. The other thing to be said is that if she was really planning to murder him, why did it take so long from when she arrived in Mesa, which was in the middle of the night around 4 a.m. She obviously slept with him. They had some kind of sexual activity. And it wasn't until more than 12 hours later that this fight occurred where Jodi ended up killing Travis, as she admitted. In my view, this was self-defense. The prosecution made a whole series of claims that Jodi had lied, including lied on the stand. None of them stand up. There was one case where the prosecutor argued she lied about how she hired her rental car, but he in fact just misquoted her testimony to try and establish that it was untrue what she said. He claimed that she'd lied to an expert witness about there being pornography on Travis Alexander's laptop, but that later turned out to actually be true. So she hadn't actually lied, as the prosecutor claimed on that. That was to Dr. Richard Samuels, who testified that he believed she was telling him the truth and he could tell if she was lying. So that was used to undermine his credibility. It's unfortunate people just get convicted without any solid proper evidence that it was murder rather than self-defense. There's no proper motive in this case. What makes sense is a domestic violence row that escalated in a very tragic way, in a very unusual way. Mainly due to there being two weapons around. This gun, which Travis owned, which wasn't corroborated at the trial, as I said, but now a witness knows that Travis did own a gun, and the knife that was around. Jodi testified about why there was this knife in the bedroom or bathroom. It had been used to cut some rope. They were going to they had played a bondage sex game or something like that. And that's why this knife was present. And due to these two weapons being present and this violent argument that arose, I think that explains how she ended up killing someone that she loved. And there is no evidence that she ever had any hatred for Travis. She loved him. The love affair was maybe over, but she still wanted to be friends. She was friends with previous boyfriends who she'd broken up with. She'd never She got no kind of criminal record, no real record of violence, other than possibly kicked her mother as a child or as a young adult. These just some very minor incidents from her childhood. So there's nothing to suggest there would be a problem there. And despite the lack of solid evidence, the prosecution were looking for the death penalty, which in my view is, well, it's inappropriate in every case, but this is a ridiculous case for the death penalty. There was no proper evidence of guilt, and that has lengthened the process considerably because we had this penalty retrial after she was originally convicted. There's been intense media coverage of the case. Jodi didn't do herself any favours by lying. I think she was intending not to go to trial but to kill herself instead. She's apparently got, at points in the past, she's felt that life isn't worth going on with, and I can understand why that could be the case, because her position perhaps appeared hopeless to her. And there were all sorts of secrets that she didn't want to come out about her and Travis and the abuse that went on in the relationship. So there we are. That's my view of this case. There's a lot more detail into the case that you can see on the website I made, which is included with this video recording.